I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 4.4 of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri. We pick up in the middle of Book 1, Religion as Simulation. The Aesthetic as the Immanence of God. I am, therefore you might be in me, is the dynamism conceded by the Alpha God. I become, therefore I might be, is the hypothesis of the Omega God. In the Alpha God cosmology, the success of life in returning to godliness does not infringe on the serene, ultimately serene, concreteness of a true and perfect reality. The anguish crowded in the Omega God cosmogony is the uncertainty of its realization, which coincides with life's realization. For life not to sanctify is for God not to realize himself, a damnation of reality incapable of redemption, that is to say, the dominion of a lower kind of order, the brutishness of non-sentient cosmos, evil as the obliteration of compassion. Such anguish is made even greater as it is shrouded in the knowledge that a future resolution, the hypothetical and justifying Omega God, will have to be monstrously foreign in order to be real, a paradoxical reality which is presented to man tomorrow and would corner him in deepest dread, the devouring splendor and fiery compassion of the true God whom man could not behold and survive. The more consciousness affirms itself and interiorizes the cosmos, the fuller becomes the realization of the mysteries ahead of us, which separate the present from the Omega God and consequently a greater degree of anguish. This is where the exponential demonism of knowledge is. It triggers greater and greater explosions of itself and consequently deeper wells of anguish. The longer the throw, the less known is the ground on which the stone falls, and the scope knowledge grows exponentially. It is my belief that in this journey into creation, the imminent resolution of this existential anguish is a fragmented genesis of the Omega God. It is a concretization in humanly acceptable terms dependent on the historical moment of fragments of the fearsome phantom of the Omega God. The resolution of this existential anguish is an aesthetic genesis, the transfiguration of anguish into a grace which is not conceptual and immaterial, but which is made instead of matter metamorphosed into spirit, is the creation of the spirit, on and by the bridge of matter. It is therefore beyond the hypothetical or the simulative, beyond prophecy and futurism. It is a fragment of the substance of the Omega God. It is legitimate and anticipatory. Legitimate since in the sum of its components, the so-called works of art, the adequate, adjourned concreteness of much of the Omega God has been realized. Anticipatory because its powerful hold on the essence of life tells of things to come. It is not a prophecy, but a radiance. Some will characterize this concept as exponential hubris, which presumes a conscious effort of life toward the creation of the Spirit, the Omega God, and defines the aesthetic process not as interpretive in the service of God, but as God-making. The only way to avoid hubris is to believe in a Father holding and manipulating fate and destiny, that is to say, manipulating evolution. If one cannot accept this view, then every step along the evolutionary path automatically becomes hubris, in the sense of emergence from a more modest parent and a thrust towards an even more ambitious offspring. But since it acknowledges the limitless agenda of the evolutionary process, it can only be humble about its own achievements. In the ascendance emergence of reality into godliness, there are two main roads afforded by the deterministic universe of mass energy. One is the road of sainthood, where vision, faith, and sufferance have the synoptic power of synthesizing in the brief span of a person or group's life the whole hypothesis of a future God. Sanctity is the living synopsis of the Omega God. Through sanctity, the discrete can gauge, if not be, the limitless. The other is the road of aesthesiogenesis, by which the residual anguish invested in a person, unequipped for prophecy and self-immolation, does not trigger sainthood, but does transfigure in personal universal terms such anguish into a particle of divinity, non-simulative, non-interpretive, non-sacrificial, non-prophetic, but an actual concrete fragment of divinity, a minuscule infinitesimal particuli sacra of the immanent achieved Omega God. Editor's note, this is sounding just a bit like Gnosticism and the idea of finding sparks in other people so that they can come together to form the light. Moving on. The aesthetic genesis is composed of acts, immanent fragments of the hypothetical Omega God. It moves from fragile object to fragile object while constructing its form. Creativity is what sainthood tends to be deprived of, since it deals with simulation or invention. Faith is what the aesthetic process tends to be without, since it deals with creation as definer of reality. Simulation on one side, a suffered implosion of it, concreteness on the other, a totality of structure on one side, forming a foci of radiance on the other, ethical guidance on one side, injection of its drive in historical discrete opuses on the other. Parenthetically, then, it appears that in the Alpha God universe, sainthood is the necessary and sufficient condition for the return of the Father. In the Omega God potential universe, the aesthetogenesis of the real is necessary and sufficient condition and can be powerfully supported and guided by the synopsis of sainthood. Ultimately, the theological structure can be seen as the simulation of aesthetogenesis, the form of a universe totally conscious that its last hiatus, full knowledge in creation, is non-dimensional because it is infinitely complex, and not temporal because it's utterly durational. The aesthetic then becomes the immanence of a future and hypothetical God. Aesthetogenesis, the genesis of the Spirit, its grace, will fully deploy its power once religion, the forecaster, and science, the explainer, can fully embark upon the task, with the media and the mechanism being in the technological world, the second-generation transformer after biotechnology of matter into spirit, of mass energy into God. The emerging creation filling the cosmos in the long cosmogenetic, aesthetogenetic evolution is pushing evil, the misdeeds of insensibility, unconsciousness, and ignorance into ever-reducing corners of reality, to the point where evil might become a geste sui generis, humoring reality with its makeshift efforts. Omega God and Science. The theological cosmology of the Alpha God leaves the scientist with a nagging sense of déjà vu, with the perception of a crack faulting the importance of scientific inquiry, since it revolves around the independent doing of an Alpha God who pre-existed science and will outlast it, and who looks indulgently on the innocent games of the scientist knotted up in the tangle of interpretation. Science as interpretation is what the Alpha God allows. Since the cognitive factor is there in the Alpha God, the cognitive attempt of man has redundance on one side and lack of originality on the other. Its function would be mainly explicative. This is not so if the cognitive has to be constructed in the absence of an a priori cognitive Alpha God. Then science is a discoverer of technologies in the preparatory stage for further technological inventions. If God is a hypothesis for the future, technology, physical and biological, would precede science inasmuch as evolution would not be overseen by the knowledge and wisdom of God, the super scientist, but would be a self-developing, self-understanding phenomenon. Reality then would develop by successive and momentous fiats, deterministic and fatal initially, but more and more willful and destined in the process of time, bumping here and there on this earth as elsewhere into ferments not wholly submissive to the statistical logics of mass energy. We call those ferments life. With them, the hypothesis of divinity appears, and within it is an instigator man with his theological simulations in parallel to the aesthetogenetic transfiguration. In this genesis, science is an information discipline. Whatever science spills into technology, art, philosophy, or religion, it spills out of itself. The semantic metaphor creative science stands for science as cognition, true whenever the information stockpile undergoes synthesis and becomes knowledge. A knowledge discipline is necessarily a past-oriented discipline, the understanding of what has been. A future-oriented science is a contradiction in terms. One can only invent or create the future, one cannot know it. Cognitive science, that is true. Pure science is about the what of the acted reality and opens the treasure chest for the hows of post-biological technology. The reasons and standards for application of those hows define the aims established by consciousness. These are the teleological philosophical decisions in which religion, as an ethically imbued simulation of possible future realities, lends a powerful supporting hand, or alternatively comes as the crushing vice of intolerance and bigotry. It is science, then, via man's consciousness, which attempts to discover what reality is, so as to give technology raw material and information adequate for invention and production. But it is technology, preponderantly biotechnology, that invents life, stocking up the pool of reality to be later discovered by science. Then technology comes along again to invent and produce that which can be called a neo-nature and man-made. Sequentially, then, 1. The physical universe, cosmogenesis. 2. Biotechnological evolution, biogenesis. 3. Scientific discovery within homogenesis. And then 4. Extrabiological technology within aesthetogenesis. Technology comes before science, and as much as the evolutionary momentum is set in technology before its understanding by the mind can begin. One can say that science is but a technology, discovery of knowledge, preceded by a technology of invention, the biotechnology of life. A clear consequence of such chronology is that science cannot decide what life had to be, is, and must become, but only into what and how it has developed up until now, and how it can carry on the process. The problem then is not technology. It has served life well up to the inception of consciousness. The problem is the conscious use of it. It is really the advent of good and evil on the sage set of life that is the source of trouble, something the Alpha God had no way of anticipating since the Garden of Eden was his programmed schedule. The proto-mental technology, from virus to beaver, had to contend for life in biological terms on the relatively clean-cut platform of survival, fitness, adaptation, mutation. The post-mental technology, from man to transman, has to deal with on the same platform, but as a primary foundation for the higher platform of fulfillment and creation, a situation of such complexity as to baffle complex and cunning life itself. The next forms to be function-filled must become compassion-impregnated so as not to be the encasement, the coffin for the termination of life. They must be the polis or fragments of God, Omega God, at the Civitius Dei, the urban effect. The aesthetic is the future maker, the God maker, since the aesthetic procreates fragments of divinity and grace from the optional, the tentative, the known, and the pragmatic, making up the anguish of man. To understand the smallness of the hedonistic niche, or the imperviousness to extravagance within true aesthetogenetic radiance, such radiance must be felt as coincidental to the art of living at its highest. The aesthetic, not a category but an objectification, is developing, creating the reality of the spirit. In this process, it makes use of the technologies and the sciences, besides being fully stormed by philosophical and religious wonderment. Creation, the aesthetic objectification, does not pre-exist itself as science does in the form of technological performance, which science is going to discover and explain. The aesthetic comes about as creation. If science is trying to grasp what technology has made reality into, history would be the part of reality which science deals with as post-natural, assuming that natural genetic changes during historical times can be considered minuscule within the immense evolutionary transformations of prehistory. Theology, the simulation of a hypothetical future godliness, a post-biotechnological and pre-scientific discipline, is neither an explanation of reality nor a creator of the future, but is instead a driving thrust pursuing the realization of its own hypotheses. In this view, religion is the trans-rational methodology skeletally constructing the future, that only aesthetically imminently, bit by single bit, will be realized, created, objectified. There is then the possibility that, for instance, the symbiotic phenomenon of the church and the Renaissance flowering of the arts has to be reevaluated in the sense that the church is the instrument for the arts, and not the arts a vulgarization of God's word, since the greatness of the church is in the history and the influence of her saints and martyrs, the synopsis of God, and in this instrumental position toward the arts. Philosophy, witness to performance and cognition, technology and science, to simulation and creation, theology and aesthetogenesis, is part of all of them and acts as a meddler in a crucible, offering ferments and yeast to the uptide of the future. The sharpest contract between Alpha God and Omega God is that for the former, the effort of man is discovery, interpretive, and adaptive, and therefore dynamic only in as far as it attempts to move consciousness from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge of the given, a given per se aloof and necessarily not perfectible, the Alpha God. For the Omega God hypothesis, dynamism is the central tenet, a possible God growing itself into fullness, concretizing its existence stage by stage, and also mapping out its quest for better devices for etha-realization. Therefore, the quest through the universe and the past so as to know more, so as to do more, so as to create more. Each person is a philosopher engaged in technology, science, and teleology. Furthermore, everyone is, at least vicariously, a creator, the artist of his or her own life in any case. Therefore, the boundaries of the different disciplines are blurred or fused into one another. Technology, being the bulk of reality, tends to take the upper hand, be it at the level of the struggle for survival or at the level of the surplus market economy. Technology asks of science the understanding of itself, past and present, so as to invent and produce new mechanisms. One could make the following hypotheses. 1. Technology successfully makes the universe into a working machine nested in the middle of determinism. The physical universe, cosmogenesis, and the biological universe, biogenesis. 2. Science adds and feeds the cognitive element into the machine by way of consciousness. 3. Theology keeps life turned toward the future in a comprehensive hypothesis that has taken the form of an unconscious simulation resulting from a past-oriented thrust, the alpha god. Sainthood is a powerful synopsis of such simulations. 4. The aesthetic transforms such simulations by fragments into concreteness, the making of the hypothetical omega god. 5. Philosophy rides the team and is driven by it and by its own private demon. The theologian is a technologian, a technician whose efforts are toward the understanding of godliness. He is the most hard-pressed and frustrated of technicians forever engaged with the phantom of his subject matter, never with it, as it does not exist as yet, and yet the divine notion is the most encompassing of all concepts and the most forceful of all hypotheses. The theologian is a technician fabricating God via simulation, not a scientist discovering God via knowledge or an artist creating fragments of God. The point is to see if he can transfer his love from a certitude he conceives as a concrete and extant, even if difficult to grasp, to a certitude of hypothesis. The love for a hypothesis, a compendium of all that might someday be, given enough love investing it. To love a hypothesis might be the true compassion of the technologian, the technician of God. The technologians of God are not engaged in discovering a non-existent deity, but rather the making of sacredness, fragment by fragment, toying in the meantime with the simulation games of an evolutionary theology. It would be important to read the holy books in the light of religion as simulation instead of as the fragmented documentation of history. They may show themselves to be depositories of radical evolutionary modes, future-making dynamos, surcharges of the vector, matter-spirit. I would suggest an institute for great simulation studies, the rewriting, transposition of the sacred books, dealing with the alpha gods, the past, and their creation, into a future predictive instrument, pointing to the evolutionary path, constructing the omega god. The institute would set out to test the idea that the whole body of myth and theology is not, as it is assumed by the transmitted fables in the sacred text, a description and interpretation of past occurrences, but is instead a predictive and simulative body of knowledge that can be made into a most powerful beacon pointing at the future. The human mind is constructed such a predictive body through a mixture of awe, fear, imagination, projection, extrapolation, compassion, and basically by the living that man does in the present, which is consistently a pre-future. It would be a character of the Institute that its own living in the pre-future would be a substantial part of the inquiry. Omega God and Sufferance. The personal trajectory from birth to death recapitulates the evolutionary trajectory. In individual terms, the second half of the trajectory is contained within the paradox of inevitable physical deterioration coupled, in the best of cases, with a sharpening of consciousness. This might more than symbolize the potential disengagement of the spirit from the material frame which is now and possibly forever sustaining it. The comparison of personal destiny to evolutionary destiny aligns personal distress with the total ambiguity of evolution. If evolution suffered from the same final weakness as personal destiny, individual death would mandatorily preclude the emergence of evolution into trans life. To die into the hands of God is the formula of the Alpha God. On the threshold of life eternal, the person is free of responsibility, unmortgaged and content. If this alternative is as comforting as the Church's promise, then both the anguished unwillingness to face personal death and the preoccupation with stunted evolution become frivolous. This promise of eternal bliss, which no one has ever had the privilege to verify, is not only cruelly ambiguous, it is a teasing screen faulting man's most noble moments. It is not a yeasty uncertainty, but rather an influence which colors actions with sinfulness, with doubts and rebelliousness, with resentments and fears. The Alpha God, in all his possible compassion, still seeks to break man the more he attempts to understand. He breaks man's fiber by making demands that only conceptual acrobatics can answer, acrobatics that often the man in the street even dismiss with small wit. The Omega God is not ambiguous in his demands and promises. He demands all, promising only more of the same endlessly. He is manifested by fragments in which he has been realized imminently for good and for evil, without an ounce of mockery or cruelty, in all candor and vulnerability. The anguish of man is imminent in him and can only find resolution momentary and short of target in the creative act, a particle of the aesthetigenic process. Godlike particles, not at the wake of a dead god, but attending at the birth of the simulated God, can, in the martyrdom of physical or mental sufferance or insanehood, render the hypothesis of God suddenly believable, giving sufferance a divine sanction. Physical suffering and illness, inasmuch as they are of fate and beyond human control, are cause for specific sensitization of life's predicament, like a border town for which periodic invasion by aliens forces works as reminder and punisher, reminder of the precariousness of being, punisher by the dead of an ever-present enemy. It is martyrdom, even though it might not reach the peaks of anguish caused by the viciousness of man and institutions. It is viciousness of the deities forming the clan of fate, all of them, an immense mob housed in the immense vats of the physical cosmos, the alpha god's fractions of its fractured self. Wouldn't it be an atrocity if the expediency of an elite, the priest-kings making up the forbidden apple of knowledge, could or would once and for all preclude the Omega God? Isn't it more fruitful, more promising, at least more self-explanatory to share in the anguish, the true distress of him who cannot dismiss his own fatal destiny as irrelevant because he feels that a similar end might expect evolution? In the struggle to find a satisfying or commensurate answer to the massiveness of the problem, though sainthood and creativity might be elusive, there is still total immersion in the tidal wave of matter bridging into spirit, and vicariously or by mimesis, man is sufferer and creator, creation indeed. What is inferred from the Alpha God is a palpable reality which is an immense reform school. What is implied in the Omega God is a reality which is an unlimited crucible for creation. What of a reformatory with lots of crucibles lying around? Those crucibles at best would be receptacles for mimetic fragments of the Omega God, at worst fakes, put there to soothe the pride of man believing himself good enough to compete with God. No matter how good the deed of man, God would have done it already, and done it better. Goodbye creation radiance, come in contrition envy. The crucible excludes the reformatory, inasmuch as the reformatory goes for false crucibles. We must choose one or the other, a poor mimesis of the Alpha God in contrition and envy, or the creation of the Omega God in fiery radiance. Omega God and means. The radiance of the achieved Omega God, a pure speculation about the future, cannot be of a political nature, nor of a social nature, nor of an economic nature. It can only be of an aesthetic nature, of grace and harmony pervading all and setting up the conditions for further synthesis. This makes clear that politics, economics, and social structures are means to ends. They are technologies in quest of content, the ultimate harmony. They cannot dictate to life, they must attend to its demands. They can be made into fetishes, idols, false gods. They cannot be god-like. They can partake of a methodological imperative, but left to themselves, they are expedient and subservient servants of all. This is an old story, but worth repeating, because it falls most often on deaf ears, and the price of such a deafness can be staggering, the enslavement of man to political, economic, and social machineries. Political, social, and economic options are many, and for hundreds of generations man has sought to find the least crude or cruel among them. The centration methodology is not an option, it is a necessary and operative condition, with which can be associated any degree of grace or disgrace, inasmuch as in both cases life is still the subject matter. As instruments for fitness, the political, economic, and social options must be parts of the coordinative effort of life. Fitness is a premise to performance. It is not performance per se. Unless we pursue health with grace in mind, even health will fail us. Therefore, to engage in political, economic, and social action without having our eyes on grace is to unleash blind forces with little purpose in mind, displaying a desperate or cynical trust in the future. The most verisimilar analogy to God is not the economist, the politician, the lawyer, the legislator, the tactician, or the priest. It's the artist. And it could not be otherwise, as it is the artist who is end-oriented, while the others are means-oriented. The artist is end-oriented because his subject matter is residual anguish itself, which he does not try to circumvent or abate, but which he transforms into fragments of the Omega God. He is the dancer among the acrobats, the one amongst the multitude, the one making emergence out of emergency, and out of necessity making spirit of matter. The non-contradictory corollary is that we are all participants in the act of creation, since none of us can make it alone. If oneness in the Alpha God is achieved by a return to innocence, then everything is expedient for re-entry into that which pre-exists from the beginning of time. Consequently, it becomes harder to sustain man in his odyssey because along the journey he has no absolute to anchor himself to, but only ritualistic procedures whose goodness or badness is relative to the perspective one surrounds them with. One does not become better inch by inch if reality is itself the only true God, existent and perfect. One fails inch by inch through exclusion from grace. Eternal damnation of a phenomenon whose fall from grace is existentially perpetual is a falling actually attributable to abortive duration, to seeing growth as past-oriented, growing into the past. Editor's note. The Alpha God manifests itself as tradition and the repetitive enforcement of culture. The Omega God manifests as discovery and, more importantly, as creation, especially intentional creation. Moving on. Omega God and greed. Greed seems to be a pragmatic wall against which any rationalization of our mind comes to break. The quiet greed of the affluent, the vociferous greed of the new rich, the potential greed of the poor. The best projections, the most optimistic ones, are made meaningless by economic pragmatism, stating that wealth will move more and more where wealth already exists. It might well be, then, that a vow of relative poverty is the most direct, realistic, and influential road available to us if we are seriously engaged in human affairs. Thousands of people are living such a vow within the affluent society. They do it by choice. If this were not true, then they are poor only because they have not found the way to get rich. Their poverty is then part of their limitations, not part of their design. They are the unsuccessful members of a quote-unquote success society. To be relatively poor does not mean to produce wealth. It means to produce wealth, but to have a life which is congruent with the condition of man, the true condition of man, his fitness in the earthly reality, and his moving into the realm of the spirit. Why is a vow of relative poverty a theological decision? Because it entails an acceptance of the demand for a responsibility toward life that can only be firm and lasting if life itself is viewed as directed, purposeful, and sacred. It is future-oriented theology in which the responsibility for the existence of godliness, purposefulness, is a purely human. Relative poverty is a condition which encourages the transformation of more matter into more spirit, since it is not prey to the gluttony of greed nor the brutalization of indigence. It must not be the dull condition of contented survival, but the burning action of persons pursuing godliness. Omega God and Ecology. If present reality is a fragment of the possible Omega God, then the ecological context has an inherent sacredness of which we can make use only if by such use this sacredness is enhanced. At the same time, it is imperative that such use be made, inasmuch as a fragment of godliness is a suffering reality, a fragment of being in the pursuit of wholeness, of grace, of fullness. But if the present is a runaway infant whose father has both the right to life and to death, and toward whom the infant feels the weariness caused by protracted and unwanted submission, that is to say, the ambiguous desire of the man-invented God to be not only the only and final authority, but also to be divested of power, since God's power signifies the foreclosure of life's freedom, then the infant can claim innocence even for the most savage act. After all, he had no voice in his conception, and his development is overseen by the contradictory paradox of a maker and breaker who is neither a maker nor a breaker. The piety of the conservationist is reflected in the Father Knows Best assumption, an injunction to one and all that what we see in nature is the will of God, that the infant is and cannot be but pure and wholesome, and therefore cannot be improved. What this kind of conservationist fails to see is the fearsome unfolding of the infant terrible, the theological process which will not stay put in spite of man or God. There is the dangerous possibility that the Alpha God and pollution coincide. For the evolutionists, the present God is a pale anticipation of the future God. Therefore, godliness is pursued according to the methodology of complexity, duration, spiritualization, and the consequent dynamism of the ever-changing ecological balance. The limits to growth have to be found in theological simulation, since it is that investigation which at the outset includes in its parameters the final parameter, the paragon, and the emergence of matter and spirit. Omega God and pantheism. The immanent God is not a pantheistic being, since it has not pre-existed. what it is in each moment of the present. It is only and purely the total vital charge present in each moment following the past moments. The pantheistic God is all achieved and ubiquitously acts upon life. The immanent God, of which the Alpha God is an attempted simulation, is in a continuous process of augmentation toward the fullness hypothesized in the Omega God. While the pantheistic divinity is just, the evolutionary divinity is wanting. Omega God and music. The identification of music with organized noise, the sounds of matter, fits more the Alpha God theology as it refers to times past. If one does not stop in time, Genesis time of the Bible, one finds music and the harmony of the spheres to be one and the same thing. This position claims a loss of grace resulting from the acquisition of consciousness and subsequent creative interference with the state of grace pristine before man's intrusion, a point for John Cage's epigones, perhaps, but a mystification of sentient life in the engrossing process of creation. Omega God and leisure. For an Omega God model, leisure can only mean a higher kind of activity, as the work of creating God must go on unremittingly. It is again the Garden of Eden, which must be seen as the origin of the pollution of the spirit, because it was in the Garden of Eden that the mind was told to remain idle, since in the idleness the vision of the Alpha God would appear. A fraud, such vision, if God is not attending to our well-being Alpha God, but is begging for his making Omega God from us life. Omega God and atheism. The Omega God hypothesis can reconcile the theologian and the atheist. To the theologian, it gives yeast to the most ambitious hypothesis ever to touch the mind of man. To the atheist, it does not demand any irrational trust in powers he cannot believe in. It just tells man that inasmuch as he fulfills himself, he adds an ounce of spirit to the quivering of life enveloping the earth. It demands that he not refuse the tenuous hypothesis that in time enough of those ounces of surmatter coming together might tip the balance from the prevalence of non-life, non-consciousness, to the prevalence of life, consciousness. That day, or much sooner, perhaps now, theologian and atheist might want to shake hands and get down to work, one in making the love of his life a little bit more concrete, and the other in making the hypothesis of his mind a bit more compassionate and imminently divine. Let's conclude section 4.4 of The Omega Seed by Paolo Soleri, the first part of Religion as Simulation. Tomorrow we continue with section 4.5, The Theology of the Sun. I'll see you then. Olam.